reading from the book of Acts, book 2 by Luke, starting with chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost had come, all of the disciples were together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each one of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds and power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" Thus ends the reading of the word. I stopped it there. I'm not reading on. Because Pentecost, people keep getting caught up in trying to figure out how Pentecost happened. Everybody keeps trying to figure out what all that stuff was about, what all those tongues of fire were about, what all that wind was about. Now, we live in Palm Springs, and if a mighty wind blew through here, we'd be going... Because, I mean, it's been happening almost every day for months, so it's not a big surprise to us. We might not even notice it if it was God. Pentecost, this day of Pentecost, isn't so much about tongues of fire, but it's about tongues in the way of communication. This is about communication. I mean, how many of us really want to spend time looking at the burning bush? Can you imagine Moses walking around the burning bush trying to figure out how it worked? And missing the message completely. What was the message of the burning bush? Not that it was on fire and wasn't consumed. What was the message? God was in the burning bush saying what to Moses? Set my people free. Oh, that's what that was about. Can you imagine if we sat there and scratched our head trying to figure out what the message was and Moses turning the river Nile into blood? That wasn't a message about turning the Nile into blood. What was it a message about? Set my people free. None of us spend time, or really should be spending a lot of time, trying to figure out, the dynamics or the physics of how Jesus walked on water. What is the point of the story? I will be with you even in the storms. I will help you even when you're drowning. If we spend a lot of time going, where were the rocks, that he walked on, then we're not getting what the communication is. So this day of Pentecost is about communication. It's about how God is now communicating anew with Jesus' disciples. Now, Jesus told his disciples, this is what I want you to do. I want you to spend the next 50 days in Jerusalem and prayer. Well, I want you to spend, it turned out to be 50 days, okay? I want you to be in Jerusalem, and I want you to be in prayer, and I want you to wait for the promised gift that I told you about. Now, we didn't know it was going to be 50 days. It could have been 60. It could have been 50 days. William Willimon, God bless him, in his wonderful commentary on the book of Acts says that the disciples waiting in prayer were participating in a very bold exercise. A lot of us in this day and age in our country think waiting is sitting with your hands folded, twiddling your thumbs, doing nothing. But this waiting was an active waiting. This waiting was a waiting in anticipation of a promise. This waiting was waiting for wonderful, good things to happen. And the bold prayer, says William Willimon, the bold prayer of these disciples was that they were talking to God, communicating with God, saying, bring that promise home, God. You have a promise, and we are expecting it. We know it's coming. Be true to your word. Bring us the promise. That was their bold prayer. I said, wow, this is incredible stuff. Did we ever think about prayer being a bold thing? No, most of us sit there and go, this was a bold time of prayer. Daily in prayer. Keep your promise, God. Keep your promise, God. Keep your promise, God. Come to us. Come to us. Bring to us what you have promised. What Jesus told us was coming. And on that day of Pentecost, God opened communication with those disciples. I talk in my sleep. Anybody talk in their sleep? No? Do you ever wake yourself up? I wake myself up talking in my sleep. I mean, nobody else could tell me I'm talking in my sleep, I let alone. When I go on vacation and I'm talking in my sleep, the roommate in vacation says, you talk in your sleep. I have no idea what I say, but my roommates in New York used to tell me that I talked in my sleep after a night shift all the time. I'd come home and I'd crash on the bed, but my brain was going a mile a minute because I was working. I had 30 children that I had to take care of all by myself as the only RN on the floor of a night shift. Kids from age 1 to age 18. And I had to do all their meds and I had to do all their IVs. And I'd go home after 2 hours of overtime on top of the 8 hours and I'd go to sleep and I'd be sitting there going, did you give that medication? And my roommates would open up the door and they'd say, yes. So I'd go back to sleep. When I was in South America, when I was in Colombia, I talked in my sleep, but I talked in my sleep in Spanish. And that's how I knew I could think in Spanish. Woohoo! There are times when we speak unconsciously and we communicate what is in the center of our soul. What we communicate is what is on our minds. Communication. I talked to Debbie Wilson this last week, just before she went back to her college reunion. She was telling me about her visit to Costa Rica and how she decided that she wanted to get on a bus, one of the village buses. We call them in Guatemala, we call them chicken buses. She wanted to get on one of the chicken buses and she wanted to ride around the villages near where she was staying and kind of see how the people lived. And so she got on the chicken bus one day, she sat next to a guy. She didn't speak any Spanish and he didn't speak any English. And she said the two of them conversed for 2 hours nonstop because they could communicate with one another. They could understand the messages that they were giving to one another, messages of friendship and welcome. When David received his humanitarian award by the Human Rights Council over at the Palm Springs City Hall, there was a woman who received the award with him by the name of Denise Chappell. Denise has a terrible stuttering affliction. And we all sat there and she was getting out this machine and she was putting that in front of her and she opened up the machine and it was an iPad. And her acceptance speech of the award was given to us, communicated to us through this device. She gave us her communication through this machine and gave us her accepted speech. She wasn't speaking, but we understood what she told us and what she had to say to us. Communication. What is the purpose of the communication of this day? God's communication with us this day. What are we to hear? How many of you have ever waited? Wait. I'm not talking about in the doctor's waiting room. You know, you had an appointment for 10 and it's now 11:45. And you're wondering if they're going to break for lunch before you get into the examination room. No, I'm talking about waiting for something that you have been hoping for in your life. Wondering when your life is going to move from point A to point B. How many of you have boldly prayed to God during that time of waiting? I hear people often, when they were having that waiting time, they say, the question oftentimes, or the prayer oftentimes is, why are you making me go through this? I went through a period of waiting between 1998 and 2003. 5 years of waiting, saying and boldly praying to God every day, what is it you want me to learn? What is it I need to learn in order to be able to live the call that you have given me? In order for me to be able to be a pastor again, what must I learn? I prayed that prayer every day for 5 years, waiting for God to move me from point A to point B, to move me from this place of waiting and wondering and questioning, waiting for that conversational moment, waiting for that time when God would say somehow to me, you are now ready. The disciples on Pentecost, during that 50 days of waiting, were praying to God and saying, we are ready. We are ready. We are ready. We are ready for you to empower us to be your instruments. We are ready for you to communicate with us and move us from here to there. The day of Pentecost is not something that lives in a timeline 2,000 years ago. We celebrate Pentecost today believing always that the Holy Spirit speaks with each and every one of us. The Holy Spirit has communication for each and every one of us. The Holy Spirit is present in our lives each and every day. And all we need to do is say, I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm ready to hear what you would have to do. We have a couple of people in our congregation who have been touched by the Holy Spirit in such a way that their lives completely changed and moved. Lois Giannopoulos, 3 years ago, when she took on the task or the challenge of organizing the Joshua Tree breakfasts, learned from that experience that she was called to be in mission, that her passion was mission, that she would invest her heart and her mind and her time and her service in mission. And the mission of this church has grown, and she has brought members of this church into that mission with her. David Tallman had that vision just 2 years ago now about feeding the hungry. He cooks pancakes at home every Sunday morning. Why not cook pancakes for the rest of the world on Sunday morning? And that vision, that challenge that came to him became a passion for many of us. We came and became a part of that story, of that call, of that movement of the Holy Spirit in his life. There are many people in this church who have had such movement of the Holy Spirit. And it only takes just that moment of our saying, I'm ready. I'm ready. Gracious God, pour out your Holy Spirit on this congregation of people, on this group of believers, that the fountain of your love may flow forth from their mouths and from their hearts, that they are the believers who can speak living water to the rest of the world. God bless them in the name of Christ.